Hey everyone, welcome back. So it seems like everywhere you turn lately, there's all this talk about Russia and the Baltic states.
Yeah, in Scandinavia too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are we looking at another potential conflict?
Well, that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Right. And we've got this piece from American Thinker published on January 5th, 2025. They really dive into this whole narrative that's building.
And not just like, IS, they're a threat, but why are we suddenly hearing so much about it?
That's the key, right? What's the motivation behind all of this? That's where I'm hoping you can shed some light for us.
Well, let's start with what the article lays out. I mean, some of the scenarios they're talking about are pretty intense.
Oh, yeah, like that Finnish newspaper Italy describing a full-blown Russian invasion.
Multi-pronged attack, paratroopers in Lapland.
They even talked about missile strikes on Helsinki.
Wild stuff. And it's not just Finland either. The article also mentions how Estonian military leaders are pushing for some pretty extreme measures.
Like talking about demolishing bridges, mining their borders, like they're prepping for a siege.
Wow. And then there's that Latvian businessman who's out there telling people to buy missiles.
Ones that can reach St. Petersburg, no less.
Right. Like, that's sending a pretty strong message.
It definitely creates this feeling like something's about to go down.
Okay, but the article doesn't just present these scenarios, right? It digs into why this narrative might be gaining traction.
Exactly. So the why question, they outline a couple of key reasons. The first is tied to what's going on in Ukraine.
Meaning, if things go badly for Ukraine.
The article suggests that the West might try to pull other countries into the conflict.
So make them think they're next.
Right. Like if you're feeling threatened, you're more likely to side with.
Right.
Well, whoever seems like they're offering protection.
Makes sense.
The second reason is a little more, I guess you could say, cynical. The article argues that fear itself can be a powerful tool.
Politically,
economically. Think about it. If you can convince people that war is on the horizon.
You can justify all sorts of things. Increased military spending.
Exactly. Restrictions on civil liberties. Maybe even cracking down on dissent, all in the name of national security. So the article is saying, this narrative of a Russian threat can be used to push through policies that might otherwise be unpopular.
So it's about manufacturing consent.
You could say that. Now, the article doesn't present this as like the only why perspective. They do point out some voices that are pushing back against the idea of an inevitable attack.
Right, like that Latvian military commander, Leonid Kalmich.
Yep. He was quoted saying he thinks a full-scale attack is unlikely. And even within the Baltic states, you see some pushback against the most extreme predictions.
So what does that tell us?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Are these dissenting voices actually a genuine counter-narrative? Or are they just there to make the whole thing seem more balanced, even if the underlying message is still one of fear?
It's like they're creating an illusion of debate.
Right. Which brings up this bigger point about how information gets used in these geopolitical situations. It's not always about presenting all sides of the story. It's about shaping perceptions, about achieving a specific goal.
Okay, so we've talked about the why, but what about the how? How is this narrative actually being built? The article talks about some pretty specific methods.
Well, one tactic they point to is the use of these like unnamed sources, NATO officials, or Western intelligence.
So it's all very official sounding, but you don't actually know WHO is saying this stuff.
Right. It lends credibility, but it's also impossible to verify. And then there's the language they use, very emotionally charged.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Oh, words like invasion, aggression, threat, stuff that triggers an immediate fear response.
It's playing to our instincts, not our logic.
Exactly. When we're afraid, we're less likely to think critically. The article also talks about how they frame any Russian military activity as inherently aggressive.
Even if it could be defensive.
Right. Like they just assume the worst possible intentions. Any troop movement, any exercise, it's all proof that an attack is imminent.
It makes you wonder how much of what we're hearing is actually based on, FCTS versus just being spun to fit a narrative.
That's the thing. The article argues that this whole Russian threat idea isn't just about public opinion. It's about using that fear to justify actions.
So what are we talking about? Like policy decisions?
Exactly. If people believe war is a real possibility, they're more likely to support things like increased military spending.
Even if it means cuts to other programs or...
Right.
Oh.
Or restrictions on civil liberties, increased surveillance, limits on free speech. The article argues that all of that can be justified if you can convince people that there's a big enough threat out there.
It's like security at any cost.
Right. And it can create this really dangerous cycle. The more you demonize the other side, the more likely conflict becomes. Because there's no room for diplomacy, for understanding, for finding common ground.
Okay, so the article lays out the narrative, the WHY might be pushed, but what about the actual likelihood of Russia attacking, say, the Baltic states? What do they say about that?
They acknowledge that Russia has been building up its military presence in the region, but they also point out that could be seen as a response to NATO expansion.
Right, like from Russia's perspective, they're being encircled.
Exactly. What one side sees as a defensive measure, the other sees as a provocation. And the article argues that a full-scale invasion would be incredibly costly for Russia. They'd face strong resistance, probably NATO intervention.
Not an easy win.
Not at all. So the article suggests maybe Russia's trying to achieve something else. Maybe deter NATO expansion, for example. Just sending a message like, don't even think about getting closer.
A classic power play.
Right. Or they could be trying to exert pressure on those countries.
Yeah.
Influence their policies, discourage them from aligning with NATO.
So it's more about influence than actual conquest.
Maybe. They also mention hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, trying to destabilize the region, undermine NATO.
That's a whole other kind of conflict, where the battleground is like information itself.
And one where Russia has shown they can be very effective.
Okay, so we're seeing all these different possibilities for Russia's intentions. But what about the West? How are they responding to this perceived threat?
Well, NATO has been increasing its own presence in the region, doing exercises, deploying troops, all that.
Yeah.
They're also trying to strengthen defenses against cyber attacks and disinformation.
So it's like an arms race, but on multiple fronts.
Kind of. But the article raises a point that's really important. They suggest that all this military buildup might actually be making things worse.
How so?
Because it escalates tensions. It increases the risk of accidental conflict.
It's like you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. So the article argues maybe a better approach is diplomacy, trying to de-escalate the situation, build trust.
Easier said than done, though, right? Given all the history, the mistrust.
It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
But they argue that it's the only way to break out of this cycle of fear and escalation.
This whole conversation is making me think about how WE should be processing all this information. I mean, it's hard enough to keep up with the news, let alone try to analyze, like, geopolitical strategy.
It can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
But that's exactly WHY. It's so important to be aware of how information is being used, how it can be shaped, and sometimes even weaponized.
So where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways as we try to make sense of all of this?
I think the biggest thing is don't just take everything at face value, whether it's from politicians, the media, even experts. You got to question, you got to be skeptical, think for yourself.
It's about critical thinking. But how do we actually DO that when we're constantly being bombarded with information? It's like we need to become investigators or something, like constantly fact-checking and trying to figure out what's real and what's not.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
We have to become much more discerning about the information we're taking in. Not just rejecting everything, but approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay, but how do we do that? I mean, where do you even start?
Well, for one thing, being aware of your own biases. I mean, we all have them, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
Our experiences, what we believe, our background, all of that shapes how we see things.
So step one is acknowledging that none of us are totally objective.
Right. And once you're aware of those biases, you can start to question them. Like, why do I believe this?
Yeah.
What evidence do I have? Am I really open to other perspectives?
So it's like holding your own beliefs up to the light and really scrutinizing them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another big part of critical thinking is being willing to change your mind. Like being open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Sure.
That new information could change what you think.
So you got to be flexible, adaptable.
Right. Recognize that learning is an ongoing thing. It never really stops.
This whole conversation has been a great example of that. But I want to circle back to the article for a second. It focuses on this narrative around Russia, but are there other examples where we see this kind of like fear-mongering, threat inflation?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It happens all the time. I mean, think about political campaigns, how they often try to paint their opponents as some kind of existential threat.
Right.
Or the way the media sometimes sensationalizes stories, focusing on the scariest or most dramatic aspects.
It's like they're trying to trigger that fight or flight response in us.
Yep. And when we're in that state, we're not thinking clearly. We're more likely to make impulsive decisions, to accept simple explanations and reject anything that challenges what we already believe.
So fear is a powerful tool for manipulation.
Absolutely. Which is why it's so important to be aware of these tactics,
Yeah.
to be mindful of how your own emotions might be clouding your judgment.
Okay, so we're constantly bombarded with these fear-inducing narratives. What's the antidote? How do we protect ourselves from being manipulated?
Well, awareness is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Once you understand the tactics, you're less likely to fall for them. And then it's about developing those critical thinking skills we were talking about. Questioning your biases, being open to new information, and being willing to change your mind.
So it all comes down to being more mindful, more skeptical of what we're seeing and hearing.
Exactly. And seeking out diverse perspectives. Don't just get your information from sources that reinforce what you already believe. Challenge yourself to consider different viewpoints, even if they make you uncomfortable.
Get our echo chamber.
Exactly. Critical thinking isn't about being right. It's about being willing to learn and grow, even if that means admitting you were wrong about something.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for making sense of the world.
Glad to hear it. Remember, critical thinking is a skill, so it takes time and practice, but it's one of the most valuable things you can develop, especially in today's world.
It's about taking back some control, you know, making conscious choices about what we believe and how we act.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into how information is being used and how it shapes what we believe.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this episode gave you some food for thought and maybe even some tools for navigating all the complexities out there. Remember, critical thinking is more than just a skill, it's a responsibility. Until next time, stay curious, keep those minds sharp, and don't be afraid to question everything.